A century-old demon has possessed the body of a young boy. A nun suffering from cancer disregards the church's taboos. She unites all exorcism methods from the east and west, and plans to seal the demon using her own womb to extract it. Song Haikyo transforms into a dark nun, bringing you an ultra-realistic exorcism experience. Without further ado, let's get started. A nun named Unia went to a building to exorcise a young boy after receiving news from Father Andrea. She carried a plastic bucket of holy water. Pouring it over the boy named Junhee, he cried out in pain, convulsing in his wheelchair. Unia pressed down on Junhee's forehead, wanting to expel the demon hidden inside him. Suddenly, Junhee became quiet, his voice deepening immensely. He stared at Unia. "You will die in the most terrible way. The demon's blood on your hands will turn into seeds, and it will burst your womb." Unia ignored the demon's warning, demanding to know its name. The exorcist must know the demon's name to drive it out of the host's body. Junhee spoke in an obscure language.
뭐라는 거야? 짜증나게.
The demon probably realized that Unia wasn't an easy target. It retreated deeper into the host's body. Junhee was sent to a Catholic hospital for care. A nurse named Helen was responsible for his care. Although this was a Catholic hospital, Helen was a person who valued science and clinical experience. She believed that most so-called possessed individuals suffered from mental illness. As long as they adhered to medication treatment and cognitive training, there was a chance for recovery. Helen's mentor, Father Paul, pulled up Junhee's records. He found that her mother had tried all sorts of absurd methods to exorcise her son. Even if the child was not ill, he was nearly killed by these cults. Paul bluntly stated that Junhee didn't need these rituals. He should receive psychological counseling and medication. But Unia didn't think so. She could sense that the demon inside Junhee was formidable, so she sought guidance from the priests of the diocese. They needed to appeal to the bishop in Rome for help, otherwise, Junhee would be in grave danger. But these high-ranking priests began to say that they needed to follow procedures and rules. In short, they didn't want to waste resources and energy on a small person. Unia clenched the rosary in her hand and left the priest's office. The leading man couldn't help but sneer. What is a nun anyway? How dare she speak to them like that? Unia knew that these old stubborn men wouldn't help. She went to find Father Andrew for a solution. Andrew was the first to encounter Junhee. He had a lot of information on hand, indicating that Junhee was deeply troubled by possession. He had even attempted to escape through suicide. Unfortunately, the demon wouldn't disappear because of that. Father Andrew also pointed out that Junhee's symptoms were very similar to those of a child named Insean. However, the records from that time had all been destroyed. This Insean is the protagonist from the priest. He was also a poor child afflicted by possession. In summary, saving Junhee was not going to be simple. After saying goodbye to Father Andrew, she went to the hospital for a checkup. She had been feeling unwell lately. To her surprise, Unia discovered that she had uterine cancer and that the cancer cells had already spread. Unia couldn't help but recall the demon's curse. She feared she didn't have much time left. Unia told the nurse that she wanted to consult Father Paul. After they met, Unia didn't mention her condition. She only wanted to ask about Junhee's situation. Father Paul bluntly stated that exorcism is a cultural practice born out of societal needs. The so-called possession is merely a fantasy that Junhee developed after experiencing exclusion and bullying. He insisted that scientific methods must be used for intervention and treatment. Unia ignored the sarcasm in Paul's words. Whether it was a demon or a fantasy, saving the child was the most important thing. However, the church now had clear regulations that only a primary physician could issue a treatment record to confirm that the patient had undergone mental treatment and still had not returned to normal. Only then would the church grant permission for exorcism. Unia had already violated church rules by performing an exorcism without permission. She hoped that Paul could give her a certificate, but Paul replied, "Junhee is currently my patient, and I won't easily grant permission for an exorcism." Meanwhile, Junhee's mother received a phone call. The person on the other end spoke harshly. Junhee's mother pleaded for a few more days, saying that she truly couldn't come up with the money right now.
몸을 굴리던가 장기라도 팔던가 이 개 같은 년아. 아들까지 미쳤다길래 불쌍해서 봐줬더니.
The woman picked up an iron chopstick. She looked at the crucifix in front of the hospital bed. A few minutes later, Helen rushed into the office. She told Father Paul that Junhee's mother had committed suicide. Her left eye had been pierced by the chopstick, and blood splattered all over the back of her head. Paul, accustomed to life and death, remained exceptionally calm. He assessed that if Junhee learned of this, he might exhibit self-harm behavior. so he arranged for staff to take turns monitoring him, ensuring that nothing happened to the child. Unia stood at the scene of the incident, and she faintly heard the demon's murmurs coming from upstairs. Facing Junhee's hospital room, she silently recited the exorcism prayer. Helen heard Unia muttering to herself, and she looked up towards the rooftop as well. In the evening, Helen wanted to attend Junhee's mother's funeral, but she was stopped at the door by a heavy rain. To her surprise, Unia drove over and offered to give her a ride. After the two nuns briefly mourned at the funeral, they went to a nearby convenience store. Unia knew that Helen was curious about why she had been reciting prayers earlier, so she proactively explained, "I have a hearing impairment. Without headphones, it's difficult for me to answer calls or listen to music. However, I can clearly hear any sound made by a demon. Those who can perceive otherworldly entities often possess a kind of spiritual sensitivity." Unia felt a similar aura from Helen, so she asked Helen, "What kind are you?" The latter's expression darkened at her words. Helen indeed had spiritual abilities and could see people's souls. She was very afraid of being seen as a witch or a sorceress. That's why Helen chose to become a nun, to suppress this ability that she believed shouldn't exist. Unia stated directly, "I need your help now. Junhee's mother's death is an opportunity. As long as they perform the exorcism before the funeral, they can take advantage of the deceased's luck." Unia finished speaking and took out a bag of documents. She asked Helen to look at them when she got back, and then decide whether to help with this task. In fact, Helen had always been resistant to supernatural phenomena. As a child, she had faced many cold stares and exclusion because of her ability to see spirits. Helen had even been locked up in a mental hospital, where she witnessed the deaths of her peers. Others called them ghost babies, claiming that these spiritually sensitive children were cursed children. Bored of humans and demons, the documents Unia gave Helen were mostly records of exorcism scenes. Those children were deeply troubled by evil spirits. Helen knew how painful this experience could be. Ultimately, she decided to help Unia. The two secretly transported Junhee out of the hospital. They went to find an elderly nun from the Liberation Nun Society. She had extensive experience in exorcism. However, she had since left the convent and become a shaman. The old nun now lived in a temple called Xiaoyuan Hall, where she lived with an abandoned boy. The old nun read Junhee's fortune, seeing the shadows of a snake and a dragon in his eyes. She pointed out that even if Junhee successfully underwent exorcism, the spirits of this child's family would fill the gaps left by the demon. In other words, Junhee is a person with high spiritual sensitivity. His mother conceived him while being possessed by an evil spirit. This kind of child is destined to embark on the path of a wizard, either enchanted or able to communicate. Unia stated that being a witch is at least better than dying. Since the phenomena within Junhee are aquatic creatures, they must set up the altar by the sea. The old nun invited someone called Bodhisattva Tanyan. He first performed the initial ceremony for Junhee. She and Unia stood nearby smoking. The old nun sensed a deathly aura surrounding them and suggested that Unia should get a checkup soon. Unia recalled her uterine cancer upon hearing this, remarking that the old nun was indeed perceptive. After the ceremony concluded, the two nuns helped Junhee into the water as instructed. The boy picked up 2 black chickens and tossed them into the sea. The shaman chanted scriptures on the shore while Unia recited prayers in the water. This exorcism ritual emphasized the combination of Eastern and Western practices. At this moment, Junhee suddenly bowed his head sharply, and his voice became rough once again. The pottery bowl at the shaman's feet shattered as well, and the black chickens were torn apart. The demon inside Junhee was indeed troublesome. To their surprise, summoning the shaman was of no use. The two had to take him back to the hospital. Paul realized that Helen had taken a patient out of the hospital without permission. He scolded her thoroughly. Then he asked Helen if she could see those things again. Helen's expression stiffened, and she immediately denied it. She told Paul that she had been cured and that she would no longer experience any hallucinations, but in reality, the souls of the deceased had never left Helen. At midnight, Unia experienced tinnitus due to her illness. Immediately after, there was a rapid knocking at the door. Unia opened the door to find it was Helen who had come to seek help. Father Paul had taken Junhee to a convent, where he was doing volunteer work. He said he would treat him with the monks there. Helen had stayed at that convent 15 years ago, where her childhood friend had died, so Helen was worried about Junhee's safety. The two parked their car nearby and walked through the thick fog towards the convent. Unexpectedly, they stumbled upon a ground covered with headless goats. In the 12 symbols, the snake represents Satan, and the goat represents the scapegoat. These are all symbols of ill omen. The two nervously entered the convent. In the hall, there was a photo from Helen's year, which included her deceased friend and a much younger Father Paul. Due to Junhee's situation spiraling out of control, the monks had to confine him to the church. Unfortunately, the crucifix couldn't contain the demon. Junhee cursed the three of them fiercely. Father Paul, your nephew will become a coward and die from a gunshot wound to the head due to an error. Then your sister will commit suicide in 2 days. Everyone present will pay for their lives. Father Paul was affected by the demon and began to choke himself. Unia quickly took out the bucket of holy water. She cut her palm and let her blood drip into it. Before she could act, the crucifix above the church began to sway dangerously. At this critical moment, Unia lunged to block Junhee. The demon revealed a triumphant smile. It rolled over and pinned Unia down, tightening its grip around her neck. In a moment of crisis, Helen grabbed the bucket of holy water and doused Junhee with it. He let out a heart-wrenching cry. The demon retreated back into the host's body. Upon waking, Junhee attempted to take his own life, but was embraced by Unia beside him.
잘할 수 있어 우리. 조금만 더 힘내보자. 살고 싶어. 저 살고 싶어요.
Helen was moved by Unia's spirit and also chose to gradually accept her abilities. Helen was skilled in divination and possessed strong spiritual power, so she took out her cards to test Junhee's fate. The main card was the Pope card, with 2 followers kneeling beneath him. Although each card had dozens of keywords, the Pope card is drawn only when circumstances are constrained. It originally signifies one who has experienced the sacred. Next, Helen drew another card, which represented the Knight of Evil. The entire card indicated that the Emperor who wields power will eventually die, and those who have experienced the sacred will preemptively resist. If Unia and Helen take the roles of followers, then they will need to find a knight. As mentioned before, the other priests were unwilling to help, so Unia could only go find Andrew. Unexpectedly, he had already been tainted by the demon within Junhee. Unia didn't hold back with him. She took out the crucifix to perform an exorcism on Andrew. However, the tainted individual lacked mental fortitude and couldn't continue participating in Junhee's exorcism ritual. Unia took Andrew's ceremonial cloak and decided to try finding other priests, but the person Unia wanted to find was on a business trip abroad. It would be difficult for him to return in a short time. Fortunately, Father Kim had reviewed Junhee's file. He had someone inform Unia that the possession on Junhee belonged to the 12 symbols. Upon hearing this, Unia wanted to borrow the keys of St. Peter in the Bible, which could seal the 12 symbols. However, the church official stated that these were national treasures and were kept under the protection of Rome. I will do my best to help you borrow them, but I can't guarantee that you will get them. Unia decided to find the old nun instead. The priests can't help, so I'll hire a shaman. The old nun calculated that the first day of the month at 3 a.m. was the time when all things disperse evil. It was best to have an exorcism at this time, and it should end before dawn, otherwise, the demon's power would grow stronger. But the problem was that the temple was fully booked on the first day. There were no available hands to help Unia. It was life and death. And yet they couldn't even find a shaman. Fortunately, they still had a chance. The Seoul Diocese finally sent Paul to help, but this science-oriented priest wasn't granted any exorcist qualifications. Find an amateur to preside over the ceremony. Are you trying to help, or do you want Junhee to die faster? Unia was extremely helpless. The bishop showed no shame at all. At the very least, Father Paul is a priest. The nuns can't even meet the conditions for conducting an exorcism. Moreover, how can the relics of St. Peter be casually handed over to an unofficial exorcism? If you don't accept Father Paul's supervision, don't even think about getting the relics of St. Peter. Unia had to suppress her displeasure inside and agreed to the Seoul Diocese's demands. Time flew by, and soon it was the day of the exorcism ceremony. The 2 nuns brought Junhee to the chosen location. As soon as they arrived, Helen rushed out of the car to vomit. This was due to the foul stench of the possessed emanating from Junhee. The demon inside had completely rotted. It was the day of the exorcism, but the weather was gloomy. Unia suppressed her unease and first tied Junhee to the iron bed. She pulled out a cotton swab to test his breath. The white cotton instantly wilted and turned black. In Korea, cotton symbolizes the Samcheon grandmother, who are the deities protecting women and children. Unia used the cotton to connect with Junhee's ancestors. Didn't the old nun say he had witch blood? Perhaps the elders in his family would help to protect their descendants and complete this ceremony. Helen felt confused. Are you a nun or a shaman? This knowledge is getting mixed up. Unia explained that even in Europe during exorcisms, priests would invite the family's guardian angels. Here, of course, we need to change the tradition a bit and incorporate elements of Taoism. Helen removed her face cover and discovered a talisman was affixed to it. Unia had truly used every means at her disposal for this exorcism. The 2 had just finished setting up the scene when Father Paul appeared with the relics. He placed the ceremonial cloak over Unia's shoulders, praying that their faith could save this child. Since Father Paul knew little about exorcisms, the ceremony was predominantly led by Unia. Exorcism is essentially an interrogation, where clergy use various methods to force out the name of the demon. During this process, they should avoid looking into Junhee's eyes and not be swayed by his words. The strength of the exorcist's faith determines whether the ritual will succeed. At this moment, the demon within Junhee gradually awakened. He began to struggle on the iron bed. Unia pressed the crucifix against his chest, repeatedly reciting prayers. The rats in the sewers felt the presence of filth and became agitated. Junhee let out a roar that extinguished the candles, and the overhead lights malfunctioned as well. Unia instructed Helen to turn on the transformer and relight the candles. Junhee rambled nonsensically, at one moment claiming that the demon was his guardian spirit, and at another, spewing profanity. At the nuns, Unia raised the holy water and poured it over him. The demon was somewhat pitiable. It had no ability to attack and could only curse while lying in bed. The exorcism ritual resembled a debate.
넌 요사스럽기만 한 잡귀야. 그것도 저급한 짐승이에요.
The demon was infuriated by Unia's attitude. It began to reveal information uncontrollably. It had existed in the world for over 200 years, during which it had caused the deaths of countless children. The demon boasted proudly about its achievements. Afterward, it belittled the nuns, mocking these greedy and foolish humans who could only rely on kneeling prayers to combat demons. Unia ignored its cold sarcasm and relentlessly pressed for the demon's name.
넌 누구고? 도대체 여긴 왜 온 거야?
The demon became a repeating machine, incessantly chanting the same phrase. The surrounding objects shook uncontrollably under its influence. Helen held onto Unia to shield her. At this moment, a shaman's voice echoed from outside. Unia looked down through the window to see that the old nun had sent the boy shaman. Don't be fooled by the fact that this kid usually stutters. He grew up in the temple, with a pure heart and clear mind. The boy's prayers had a significant impact on the demon. Unia glanced at the cards in her hand. The 3 essential elements to subdue the demon were complete. She continued the ceremony with Helen. The demon became enraged, stirring up a fierce wind. The boy shaman, undeterred, got back up and continued to pray. Helen also kept pouring holy water over Junhee. Suddenly, the demon's demeanor changed, pleading for help in a child's voice, but Unia was utterly unmoved. Her resolve was even stronger than that of the monks seeking enlightenment. The demon was in immense pain from her torment.
이름을 말해봐. 나를 두려움에 떨게 만들어봐.
Knowing the name makes it easier, Unia shouted the name of Samikina, in the name of the Holy Father, Holy Son, and Holy Spirit, finally removing a black aura from Junhee's body. However, the nuns couldn't rely on their own strength to eliminate this centuries-old evil spirit. The only chance was to seal it away and then cast it down to hell, into the priest. The protagonist sealed the demon with a piglet. Unia used her cancerous womb to seal Samikina. She sealed Samikina within herself. But the demon had not given up yet. It wanted to return to Junhee's body. As the factory used for the exorcism was about to collapse, Unia asked Helen and the boy shaman to take Junhee to the nearest church, climb to the top floor, and strike the bell 3 times. Without delay, Helen hurried off. However, the streets were filled with scurrying rats, which intentionally blocked the traffic to hinder Helen. The boy shaman carried Junhee and ran towards the church with Helen. Unexpectedly, they were grazed by a motorcycle along the way. The boy shaman injured his ankle, making it difficult for him to move. Helen had to run to the church alone. She climbed to the top floor and grabbed the rope. 3 loud clangs echoed through the night sky. Unia took a deep breath and walked into the sea of flames. The flames would purify all impurities and burn away all evil. Unia fulfilled her duty as a nun. Soon after, the priest who had been on a mission abroad returned. He was the protagonist from the previous film, The Priest. Helen stayed at the Holy Cross Church with the priest, continuing her duties as an exorcist. The film concludes here. One review said it very well. The first film, The Priests, simply copied Hollywood's exorcism story and had Koreans perform it, while The Priests 2, Dark Nuns took the story from The Priests and had Korean women perform it again. The story is somewhat thin, but the staging is decent. Although Korean forums called for a boycott of the film due to the final maternal sealing concept, the demon's confrontation with Unia constantly insulted her female identity, deriding her sick womb. In classical mysteries, women were mostly used as tools for the resurrection of demons or for childbirth. The church even prohibited nuns from conducting exorcisms. Unia's actions in the film were quite unique. She viewed the demon as a corrupt female body, transforming it into a weapon to kill it. Isn't this another form of resistance in itself? On its own, the film doesn't seem to have any intention of offending women, but for a problem that a male priest can solve with a piglet, it requires a nun to sacrifice herself. With such a double standard from the director, it's no wonder that viewers can't stand it.